In a previous podcast, I discussed traumatic brain injury, and in that podcast, I mentioned neurofeedback. And today on Ask Dr. Gill, I want to discuss neurofeedback, how it helps the brain, and what it is good for. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Ask Dr. Gill podcast. I'm Dr. Gill Winkleman, your naturopathic doctor with a master's in counseling psychology, in case you don't know who I am. And I am doing this as a simulcast again because there are video aspects of this that are, I think, important to be able to see. If you're listening to this, most of the information I will describe for you, but if you get a chance to go to YouTube, you can check out my channel there. And I do post videos. I put the podcasts on there because I think people can find them more easily, and it just sort of happens automagically as well. But I think that this is an important medium for some of my viewers. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or from my website, don't worry about it. I will describe this as much as I can, but you can check out my website, askdrgill.com, to get more information. So what is neurofeedback? Well, before I jump into describing it, I want to give this quote from Frank Duffy, who I believe is no longer at Harvard, but was at Harvard when he said this. He was a professor of pediatric neurology, and he said scholarly literature suggests that neurofeedback, quote, should play a major therapeutic role in many difficult areas. In my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. It is a field to be taken seriously by all. And unfortunately, neurofeedback really isn't utilized in mainstream as much as it could be and maybe should be. And I think there's a layer of issue in medicine that I may talk about at some point, which is, and this is both the medical community and the patient community, which is this expectation of, well, I shouldn't need to come in and see the doctor unless I absolutely necessary. They should give me something, or I should be able to figure this out myself. And sometimes that is definitely a possibility, but sometimes you do need the interaction with the practitioner in some form to find health. And I think therapy, psychotherapy, for example, a lot of psychotherapy is not so much about a technique or anything. It's more about how do you relate to somebody else, right? And that's healing. The therapeutic relationship can be very healing. Neurofeedback has pieces of that, but there's also something that is special about it, and I'll describe that in a minute. So what is neurofeedback? Neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback. So I should probably say what biofeedback is. Biofeedback is basically a form of feedback given to the body from something outside of you. And if you think of like a mood ring or one of those pencils that changes colors, it's responding to heat and or pressure from your body, so you can see when it changes colors, oh, I'm X, I'm feeling whatever. Now, I don't want to say that that's a super accurate way of doing things, but that's biofeedback, right? That's a simple biofeedback. And heart rate variability training, that's another form of biofeedback. I used to do something called heart math in my office. I'm not doing that so much anymore, but heart math is great. And by the way, that's something you can do at home, where it's using your breath and your heart rate to help you see that in the screen, and then you can change your breathing, which then changes your heart rate, right? So there's an outside stimulus showing you what you need to do, so that you can make changes. And neurofeedback does the same thing, same idea, but with brain waves or electroencephalograms. Now, there are different types of neurofeedback. Traditional neurofeedback is usually training for a particular frequency based on the issue or the amplitude based on the issue. So it's trying to get people to use certain types of brain waves and to narrow the frequency or the amplitude of that particular brainwave. Now, it rewards the brain for using those frequencies. So if you have someone who, and I'll explain what the frequencies are. So if you have someone who is sort of in la la land, sort of fantasizing, we would say that that's potentially that they're in theta waves. So we'd reward them for alpha waves or beta waves, low beta waves. And so that's kind of the idea behind traditional neurofeedback. This is where a picture is worth 1,000 words, so people kind of understand how this is done. This is a one-channel system similar to what I use in my office in Honolulu, and you have clips on both ears, and then you have one other point that you move somewhere along the head that helps the person do this. In this case, he's watching another screen. Can't really see that in this picture, but I can tell. And that's kind of how he's starting that training. The practitioner is looking at the other screen and seeing what's going on. Now, typically, I would start this process with an interview, and I would find out first of all, why the person's coming in and what it is that they want to see that's different. And also areas that might be affected by neurofeedback that is then being impacted. In other words, let's say someone came in and for anxiety, as a simple example, but they also had sleep issues. So that would be something to note, because sometimes the presenting issue is not the first thing that gets better. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So we start by mapping, and I use something called lens, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. So the mapping is a treatment, or can be used for a treatment depending on the system. But we use that to guide how to proceed. And there's different types of maps. So in traditional neurofeedback, the map on the left, that's a much more detailed way of approaching the mapping. And in fact, generally you do all points at once. And you're just measuring, you're just seeing what is the brain doing. And you get this picture of how the brain is working. The other map, the one on the right, is the lens map. And this gives us a sense of what's going on in terms of each of the frequencies, how big they are, and which ones are dominant. And in this particular case, we see that the delta amplitudes at the top suggest that this person had multiple head traumas, probably 2 or 3. I actually don't remember this particular map because it's from so long ago. And then if you look at the bottom the mean dominant frequency, most of the right side of the brain, which is the right, because we're looking at the top of the head down. In this particular case, most of this person's brain is we would say asleep, like they're in delta dominance. And that is consistent with head trauma. And so this particular person would have had a fair amount of sessions, and eventually it would have changed over time. So I mentioned this before, there's a ton of research on neurofeedback, and actually it's closer to 65 years of research now, because neurofeedback was probably, I'll say, invented. I mean, it may have happened before that, but we'll say in the 60s. It was actually, there have been many research studies since then to show that neurofeedback is not only very effective for ADHD and TBI, it's over 80% effective for symptom improvement using neurofeedback. It's neuroprotective. And so we find that people who've had neurofeedback have a lower incidence of PTSD and post-concussive issues if they have another concussion later. So it's kind of interesting. And you know, when I mentioned in the TBI podcast that I got hit in the head with my surfboard, And I wasn't too worried about it because I've had so much neurofeedback over the years. I thought, well, I'll go in and get some more after this, but I figured I wasn't going to have any issues post that, and so far I haven't, so which is good. Okay, so neurofeedback, highly effective. I mentioned this for treating TBI, but it's also effective for other conditions, some of which you might not expect: ADD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, multiple sclerosis, but fibromyalgia. And the interesting thing about fibromyalgia is that may be a stress response. So we don't think of it in terms of a brain issue necessarily, because it's usually somewhere all over the body, but it probably is a brain issue because it responds to neurofeedback really nicely. But basically, neurofeedback is good for anything originating in the brain. Now, a few caveats to that. I haven't really done neurofeedback on schizophrenics. I've used Walsh protocol for schizophrenics, and I have done this with bipolar, but I've used it with people with bipolar who are also having other treatments. So those are the two that I would say I have the caveats on. But pretty much everything else, which is a lot of different things: depression, anxiety, schizoaffective disorder, I've treated with that, not by itself, ADHD, TBI definitely, sleep issues. And it's very, very powerful as far as that goes. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about a little more detail of the low energy neurofeedback system. And I may go through a couple of case studies as well. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Gill. I'm Dr. Gil Winkleman, and today on the podcast, we've been talking about neurofeedback and the various ways that it can help people. And if you want more information about this, definitely check out my website, askdrgill.com. I have several articles about neurofeedback on here, as well as other articles about health and wellness and so forth. So I want to talk about the low energy neurofeedback system, or LENS, which is the way that I do neurofeedback. And it's very interesting. It's a very different method of brain training. So instead of saying, all right, you have ADD, and to be fair, with traditional neurofeedback, they're looking at the brain map saying, well, the person's coming in with ADD. This is what's going on in the brain. We're going to retrain the brain to work more efficiently, right? So that's kind of the way they look at it. But with LENS, we're working on this concept of neuroplasticity. Now, what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is this idea that the brain is always retraining itself. It's responding to input from the environment and so forth. The problem is that we get stuck in a groove, if you will. So we have the same thoughts. We keep going. We keep thinking, oh, this is bad, or this is good, whatever it is. And we get stuck there. It's kind of like our political situation right now, where everyone sort of watches the news if they're political. If you're not political, forgive me on this. But if you're conservative, you watch the conservative channels, for example, or media outlets or boards or whatever it is, and they reaffirm your belief systems. And if you're liberal, same thing, right? Everyone's in their own echo chamber, and that's kind of what happens to our brains. So what LENS is doing is it's taking us out of our echo chamber. It's giving us something new where we can go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Now, it's not that conscious, just so you know. It's basically about changing the dominant frequency, the peak of that EEG frequency, sending an offset based on a variable. And that variable is what the practitioner controls. And then the feedback frequency is based off of that. So in other words, let's say that you have a dominant frequency of 4 hertz. Well, we would give you something at, say, 6 hertz, and that might move that change. So it allows the brain to retrain itself. With neurofeedback with brainwaves, we have two basic parameters. We have amplitudes, which are the height of the waves. So you go from 0 to a max to 0 to a min back to 0. And that max and min basically are the same value, but one is positive, one's negative, right? So that's the amplitude of the wave. And the frequency is how quickly it does that. And so the frequency we have as a function of the type of brainwave, and the amplitude is the height. So I mentioned delta waves. There's delta, theta, beta, alpha, and gamma waves. Now, the lens system does not measure gamma waves. Gamma waves are kind of the waves that we use. Actually, long-term meditators have those. So gamma waves are when you feel you're on the same wavelength as someone, that's a gamma wave. And delta waves are carrier wave for gamma waves, but they also can be waves that are basically show up when there's head trauma as well. So the distinction is important, and it's subtle. And practitioners sometimes get confused about that because it's like, well, that's why is this happening? Why aren't you having more problems with this? Well, we're not seeing the gamma waves because we don't measure that. But so what we're trying to do is basically change the amplitudes so that there's variability in that, kind of like heart rate variability. We want people, and we want variability in the frequency as well, but we want people to have variation in their brainwaves. And when there isn't enough variation, that's when there's that stuckness. So this is kind of an interesting piece in terms of how we work with this. Now, for you, this is less important. It's more important for the practitioner understanding that. Now, the advantages of lens, in my opinion, is that treatment appears to be shortened by at least 40%. And what's nice about that, too, is that we generally know within 5 to 10 sessions if the lens is going to do something. Now, there are cases that I've had where the neurofeedback, the lens that I was giving, did not have an impact on someone, and they went to get traditional neurofeedback, and all of a sudden they got better. Now, is that because the lens loosened something up and they needed the other to sort of refine it? Or was it that the lens didn't do anything? We don't know. And that's an impossible study to do. But what I do know is if the lens isn't going to work, I know pretty quickly, because I don't see changes or the patient doesn't see changes. So the other advantage is because the sessions are short, it can be used with people who have attention issues, stamina issues, or impulse control issues. So I've used this with babies in the past, and I've used it with people with lots of impulse control. I've used it with people who were not motivated to be patients. They were usually brought in by their loved one, and they were like, wow, I feel different all of a sudden. Can be used with disabling conditions such as really severe head injuries and autism. I've had great success with autism with this. Now, one caveat about that is that the success I've had with autistic patients is not always the thing that the patient or their family brought them in for. And one example of that is I had a patient years and years ago. He was actually the first patient I saw with autism in my private practice. And he started talking. He hadn't talked in years. And this mom put this out on a listserv that was local and said, hey, my son's talking. You should get your kid's neurofeedback. I swear I must have seen 50 people with autism in a very short amount of time, less than 6 months. None of them talked, none of them. But 80% of them showed benefits. They had better impulse control. They were more cooperative with their family and their teacher if that was an issue. Their sleep was better. Their attention was better. They were able to follow instructions, but they weren't necessarily talking. And I say that because oftentimes the thing that we want fixed doesn't necessarily get fixed. That's true in all of medicine. And gosh, if I knew that, that would be amazing. But anyway, and then the other thing is you can use it with animals, although I don't use it with animals because I can't, but other people, veterinarians, have used it with animals. So that's the advantage, in my opinion, of using Lens. So it's been amazingly effective. And if you aren't in Hawaii, I would say see if you can find someone locally. I mean, obviously, you can come here and see me. I am starting to get my feet back under me since the pandemic of doing neurofeedback again and working on doing intensive so that people can come. Usually, I like to see people once a week for an amount of time because that gives the brain time to sort of adjust to the system. But I have done intensives where I do 2 or 3 treatments in a day for 3 to 4 days and then send people home. And it's more like that particular case is like winding up a spring, and you wind it up, and people don't necessarily notice what's going on. And then they notice it, 6 weeks to 6 months down the road. They're like, oh, something's different. So it's definitely a very different experience, but that is something that can be done as well. So basically, the thing about neurofeedback is it's a great alternative to medication or vitamins. Some people have trouble. They're just like, yeah, I don't want to take vitamins. And although I think for brain injury, vitamins can be very important as sort of that supplementing the injury, if you will. And neurofeedback can treat injuries after the fact. And the other thing about neurofeedback is that I think it treats, going back to TBI. So someone who has a TBI and then say a year later they're having attention issues. Well, the neurofeedback is very direct in terms of treating the attention issues, as opposed to giving someone, say, Adderall or Ritalin or something like that, where you're really just speeding them up because everything is slowed down. So in any case, I hope you got something out of this. If you have questions, feel free to send an email, gil@askdrgil.com, or you can check me out on the website or send a comment. This is my contact information in Hawaii. And if you have questions or if you like this, please subscribe to my channel or put a comment below, either on the video or on the podcast. It's really helpful for me. And feel free to share it with people if you liked it too. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.